A racist cop thought they could frame her, but they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. The badge that was meant to protect the innocent became a weapon of injustice, wielded against someone who refused to be a victim. Little did they know she would become their worst nightmare. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Gloria Silver wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stepped out of the small neighborhood pharmacy, clutching her prescription bag tightly against her chest. The evening air hung heavy with moisture, typical of Salvador's summer heat, that seemed to press down on everything and everyone. After working a double shift at the hospital, her nurse's uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin, the fabric damp despite the setting sun. All she wanted now was the sanctuary of her modest kitchen, where the soothing sounds of gospel music would drift from her old radio while she prepared a glass of sweet tea. The thought of that simple comfort was what had kept her going through the final hours of her shift, attending to patients with the same care and dignity she always provided. Despite her exhaustion, the streetlight above flickered erratically, casting uneven shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Gloria adjusted her nurse's badge, still clipped to her uniform, and began walking toward the bus stop. 3 more blocks, and she could sit down, at least for the duration of the ride home. The sudden screech of tires against asphalt shattered the evening quiet. A patrol car swerved to the curb, its headlights momentarily blinding her. 2 officers emerged in swift, practiced movements. Gloria recognized them immediately, Ricardo Costa and Daniel Oliveira, known figures in the neighborhood, though not necessarily for positive reasons. Gloria Silver! Ricardo's voice carried an edge that made her stomach tighten. His face was set in hard lines, eyes cold beneath the brim of his cap as he positioned himself directly in her path. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. Daniel hung back slightly, his expression unreadable as his partner stepped closer. Gloria noticed his hesitation, the way his eyes darted between her and Ricardo, as though uncertain. We've received information about prescription fraud," Ricardo announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry to the nearby apartments where curious faces were already appearing in windows. "That medication you're carrying, obtained illegally, wasn't it?" Gloria's fingers tightened around the pharmacy bag. "There must be some mistake. I've been taking this medication for years. I have a legitimate prescription from my doctor." Ricardo's laugh was short and dismissive. That's what they all say." He reached for the bag, his other hand moving to his belt. "You're going to need to come with us." Nurse Silver. Gloria's nurse's badge caught the streetlight's glow as she stood her ground, dignity intact despite the humiliation burning through her. Neighbors were watching now, witnessing her moment of crisis as Ricardo continued his accusations, his voice echoing down the quiet street for everyone to hear. "Mate, I've been taking this medication for 3 years now," Gloria Silver explained, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She held up the small white pharmacy bag, the receipt peeking out from the top. "You can call Dr. Mendez to confirm. He's my primary physician." Officer Ricardo Costa's face remained impassive, a mask of authority that revealed nothing but contempt. "That's what they all say," he replied, deliberately loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear. We've had reports of prescription fraud in this area." Gloria noticed movement behind curtained windows across the street. The Oliveira family, who had lived there for decades, were watching. So were the Martinses 2 doors down. Their faces were partially hidden, but their eyes conveyed a familiar mixture of curiosity and fear, the look of people who wanted to help but were afraid of becoming targets themselves. "Please, just call the pharmacy," Gloria pleaded, her nurse's badge catching the glow of the streetlight. "Senor Moreira knows me. I've been going there for years." Ricardo ignored her words completely. With a swift, practiced motion, he pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal gleamed coldly in the humid night air. "Turn around," he ordered. "This is ridiculous," Gloria protested, but complied. Years of conditioning to respect authority overriding her indignation. the metal clasped around her wrists with a definitive click that seemed to echo through the quiet street. Officer Daniel Oliveira stood slightly back, his eyes darting between his partner and Gloria. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Ricardo, maybe we should verify with the pharmacy first," he suggested quietly. Ricardo shot him a withering glare. "We follow procedure, rookie. We investigate at the station." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. Following orders, he placed his hand on Gloria's shoulder and guided her toward the patrol car. His touch was gentler than Ricardo's would have been, but it felt like a betrayal nonetheless. The back seat of the police vehicle smelled of stale sweat and something metallic, blood, perhaps, or fear. Gloria's stomach lurched as the door slammed shut, sealing her inside. The prescription bag sat on the passenger seat up front, just out of reach. The solution to this nightmare tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Through the window, Gloria could see more neighbors emerging from their homes, whispering to each other. Some had phones out, recording discreetly. Mrs. Santos, an elderly woman Gloria had cared for during her hospital stay last winter, stood on her porch with her hand over her mouth. As the engine started and the car pulled away, Gloria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of metal and sweat made her stomach churn with each turn of the wheels, taking her further from home. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow that made Gloria Silva's skin appear sallow. She sat rigidly on the cold metal bench, her back straight despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. The humiliation burned hotter than the July night she'd left behind, but she refused to let it break her. Officers moved through the station, some casting curious glances her way, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. Gloria fixed her gaze on a water stain on the opposite wall, counting the seconds between each drip from a leaky pipe somewhere in the ceiling. Anything to avoid meeting Ricardo Costa's mocking eyes as he lounged at his desk, filling out his report with exaggerated slowness. "You know, nurse," Ricardo called out, emphasizing her profession like it was something shameful. "Prescription fraud is a serious offense. You people think you're above the law because you wear scrubs." Gloria's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, but she remained silent. The cool metal beneath her palms grounded her, a reminder that this moment, like all moments, would eventually pass. Daniel Oliveira stood by the water cooler, pretending to be occupied with his paper cup. The younger officer kept glancing in her direction, guilt flickering across his features before he would quickly look away. Once, their eyes met briefly, and Daniel seemed about to speak, but Ricardo barked an order, and the moment dissolved. As the clock ticked past midnight, Gloria closed her eyes and thought of her father. Walter Silva had spent years as a Policia federal agent, facing prejudice with unwavering dignity. "Never let them see you break," he'd told her once, after she'd come home crying from school. "Though your dignity isn't something they can take unless you surrender it." The memory of her father's voice steadied her. Gloria straightened her nurse's badge, still clipped to her uniform after her double shift. She'd cared for 3 critical patients today, held an elderly woman's hand as she passed, and comforted a frightened child. No false accusation could erase that work or diminish who she was. Daniel approached hesitantly, clipboard in hand. We need your fingerprints," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Gloria stood slowly, her movements deliberate and composed. As she followed him to the processing desk, she held her head high, feeling the weight of her father's lessons carrying her forward. The indignity of the moment would not define her, but her response to it might define everything that followed. By dawn, the video had spread like wildfire through Salvador's close-knit neighborhoods. A grainy cell phone recording captured Ricardo Costa roughly manhandling Gloria Silva outside the pharmacy, his face twisted with contempt as he forced her into the patrol car. The footage, shakily filmed by a terrified bystander, had been shared hundreds of times overnight, each view fueling a growing storm of outrage. Gloria sat at her kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled scrubs. Her smartphone buzzed relentlessly beside a cooling cup of tea. Text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications flooded in faster than she could process them. Colleagues from the hospital, church members, neighbors she barely knew, all reaching out with shock and support. "You need to eat something," Walter Silver said, placing a plate of toast before his daughter. The retired federal agent moved with purpose around the modest kitchen, his weathered hands steady as he prepared a pot of strong coffee. The familiar scent of pesigo calda, peach preserves, filled the air as he opened a jar of Gloria's favorite comfort food. "I can't believe they posted my name and address online," Gloria whispered, scrolling through a local news site. "Everyone can see." Walter's jaw tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "This is deliberate intimidation. I've seen it before." He sat across from her, his eyes, so like her own, filled with a determined fire. This wasn't random. "Ophelia, officers don't just harass respected nurses without reason." Gloria's phone rang again. Marcos Rocha, a civil rights attorney whose name had been mentioned by 3 different people already. She silenced it, needing just a moment more before facing the world. Outside, a news van pulled up. Walter moved to the window, drawing the curtains with practiced efficiency. In his 30 years with the Policia Federal, he'd investigated corrupt officials and organized crime. The father knew exactly what happened when power went unchecked. "That officer, Costa, I made some calls this morning. There have been complaints before." Walter's voice remained calm, but Gloria recognized the controlled anger beneath, always dismissed, always involving people who look like us. Gloria touched the pharmacy receipt still in her pocket, irrefutable proof of her innocence that Ricardo had refused to even glance at. She thought of Daniel Oliveira's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in the younger officer's eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked, her nurse's hands that had comforted the dying and welcomed newborns, trembling slightly. Walter took her fingers in his own. "We fight, but not alone." He nodded toward the window where, beyond the news van, neighbors had begun to gather. "Salvador won't stand for this. Not anymore." Walter Silver sat at Gloria's kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed Portuguese. His weathered hands tapped a familiar rhythm on the wooden surface as he called in favors from former colleagues at the Policia Federal. Years of service had built a network that stretched all the way to Brasilia, and now he was activating every connection. "Papa, you don't have to do this," Gloria whispered, setting a cup of sweet tea beside him. Walter covered the mouthpiece. "These people don't know who they're dealing with, Filha. I didn't spend 25 years enforcing the law to watch it be abused against my own daughter." Gloria watched her father work, his face set with the same determination she remembered from childhood. When he finally hung up, the retired agent took her hands in his. "Listen carefully," Walter said, his voice gentle but grave. "This will get uglier before it gets better. Ricardo Costa has friends in the department. They'll try to discredit you, maybe even threaten you." He squeezed her fingers. "But I promise you won't face this alone." Gloria nodded, drawing strength from her father's resolve. The kitchen, usually her sanctuary, now felt like the calm center of an approaching storm. Across town, Senor Moreira hunched over his desk in the back room of the pharmacy. The manager's fingers trembled slightly as he carefully altered prescription records, creating a false history that would support Ricardo's accusation. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the stench of his betrayal. His phone buzzed. Ricardo Costa's name flashed on the screen. "Is it done?" the officer demanded without greeting. "Yes," Moreira whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "The records now show irregular patterns. It looks like she's been doctor shopping." Ricardo's laugh was cold. "Perfect. People like her need to be taught a lesson about their place." "What exactly did she do to you?" Moreira asked, curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. "She existed," Ricardo replied flatly, "and she didn't show proper respect when I questioned her last month about a disturbance. Nobody disrespects me in my jurisdiction." After hanging up, Moreira stared at the falsified documents, shame and fear battling within him, but it was too late to turn back now. That evening, as Gloria described the conversation to Marcos Rocha, the attorney's face darkened with concern. "The rot runs deeper than I feared," Gloria said, her nurse's hand steady despite her words. "It's not just one bad officer, it's a system." Marcos nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to fight the system itself." Outside, the humid Salvador air carried the distant sound of church bells. Gloria straightened her shoulders, her father's daughter to the core. The doorbell chimed through Gloria Silva's modest home 3 days after her release. When she opened the door, a man in a crisp linen suit stood there, briefcase in hand, his eyes reflecting both compassion and determination. "Gloria Silva, I'm Marcos Rocha, civil rights attorney," he said, extending his hand. "May I come in?" In her living room, surrounded by the comforting scent of her father's coffee, Marcos laid out documents across her coffee table. His voice was gentle but carried an undercurrent of steel as he explained what he'd discovered. "This wasn't random. And Gloria," he said, pointing to a pattern of similar incidents, "your arrest is part of something systematic. Officer Costa has a history of targeting people like you, hard-working citizens with no criminal record." Walter Silva stood in the doorway, arms crossed, nodding slightly as the attorney spoke. The retired federal agent had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his jaw tighten. "With your permission," Marcos continued, "I want to represent you, not just to clear your name, but to expose what's happening in Salvador. Your case could be the key that unlocks everything." Gloria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water. The nurse who had spent 15 years caring for others now faced a decision that would define her life moving forward. "What would it mean?" she asked quietly. "For me? For my privacy?" Marcos didn't sugarcoat it. "It would be public. There would be scrutiny, questions, and possibly backlash from those who support the police unconditionally. Officer Costa has friends in the department, and Senor Moreira from the pharmacy is already changing his story to match Ricardo's version." Gloria walked to the window, watching neighborhood children play in the humid evening air. She thought of her patients, the elderly woman who'd squeezed her hand in gratitude last week, the young father whose life she'd helped save during a cardiac emergency. "How many others?" she finally asked, turning back to face Marcos. "At least 7 cases I've found so far, all dismissed as misunderstandings or buried in paperwork. Mayor Souza has been looking the other way." Gloria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her bones. But beneath that fatigue burned something stronger, the same determination that had carried her through double shifts and difficult cases. My father taught me that silence only protects the wrong people," she said, meeting Marcos's gaze. "I've spent my life helping others heal. Maybe this is just another way of doing that." Walter stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Tell me what we need to do next," Gloria said, her decision made. "I'm ready to fight." The city council chamber buzzed with tension as Marcos Rocha stood at the podium, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He held his smartphone high, the viral video of Gloria's arrest playing for all to see. The grainy footage showed Ricardo Costa roughly handling Gloria outside the pharmacy, her nurse's badge still visible on her uniform. "This is not an isolated incident," Marcos declared, his normally gentle tone replaced with righteous indignation. "This is systematic harassment happening in our community." Mayor Antonio Souza shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his collar as sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. "We take these allegations very seriously," he began, his practiced political voice wavering slightly, "but we must allow the proper investigation to—" "How many more videos do you need?" Marcos interrupted, placing a folder on the table. "How many more citizens need to be humiliated before action is taken?" The crowd erupted, with community members rising to their feet. An elderly woman who had been treated by Gloria at the hospital shouted about the nurse's compassion. A local shop owner described witnessing previous incidents involving Officer Costa. Antonio attempted to regain control, banging his gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order in this chamber!" But his authority was crumbling as council members exchanged concerned glances. Outside the building, the gathering had swelled. Pastor Oliveira from the First Baptist Church led a circle of prayer, his deep voice carrying across the square. Local merchants had closed their shops early to join the vigil, holding handmade signs demanding justice. The sweet voices of the church choir rose in gospel harmony, their songs of redemption and perseverance floating through the humid Salvador air. Gloria stood at the edge of the crowd, her father Walter at her side. She hadn't wanted to come, preferring to avoid the public eye. But Walter had insisted she witness this moment. "Sometimes you need to see that you're not alone," he had told her that morning over coffee. Now, as she watched her neighbors, patients, and even strangers unite in support, tears stung her eyes. A woman she recognized from the hospital cafeteria approached and wordlessly embraced her. Then another person came. And another. "I never wanted this," Gloria whispered to her father, her voice trembling. Walter squeezed her hand. "Sometimes we don't choose our battles, Fila. Sometimes they choose us." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Gloria realized with a mixture of awe and trepidation that her personal humiliation had transformed into something much larger. A rallying cry for a community that had suffered in silence for too long. The manila envelope arrived without a return address. Just Marcos Rocha's name scrawled across the front in hurried handwriting. The attorney's office was quiet that afternoon, the ceiling fan pushing around the humid Salvador air without much success. Marcos opened it carefully, his eyebrows rising as he spread the contents across his desk. "My God," he whispered, scanning the documents. Before him lay 15 separate civilian complaints against officers Ricardo Costa and Daniel Oliveira, dating back 3 years. Each one detailed similar scenarios: false accusations, intimidation, targeting of working-class citizens, particularly those of color. Every complaint had been summarily dismissed or buried by internal affairs. Marcos ran his fingers through his hair, the weight of what he held becoming clear. This wasn't just about Gloria Silva anymore. The nurse's case was merely the latest in a disturbing pattern. He organized the papers meticulously, searching for connections, names of witnesses who might still be willing to come forward. The attorney's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. More coming. Be careful." When he opened his inbox, he found screenshots of internal police communications, Ricardo boasting about putting people in their place and references to targeting specific neighborhoods. Daniel Oliveira sat in his car 3 blocks away, his hands trembling as he pressed send on another anonymous message. The younger officer hadn't slept properly since Gloria's arrest. Every night, the image of her dignified face as they pushed her into the patrol car haunted him. The memory of Ricardo's satisfied smirk made his stomach turn. "This isn't what I signed up for," Daniel muttered to himself, glancing nervously at the station entrance. Each document he forwarded to Marcos felt like both a betrayal and a redemption. He knew Ricardo suspected something. The senior officer had been watching him closely, making casual threats disguised as jokes. Back in his office, Marcos compiled everything into a secure digital folder. This evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse, but he needed more, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or disgruntled civilians with grudges. "We need to find others willing to testify," he told Luciana Cardoso when she arrived later that evening. The journalist nodded, already thinking about contacts who might help connect dots. "If Daniel keeps feeding us information," she said, "we might have enough for the Policia Federal to step in." What had started as one woman's fight for dignity was evolving into something much larger, a chance to expose corruption that had poisoned the system for years. As night fell over Salvador, both Marcos and Daniel, from their separate locations, stared at their phones. Knowing each message exchanged was another step toward justice or danger. Gloria Silva's modest home had transformed overnight. Television vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers. Reporters camped on her lawn, microphones at the ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the nurse whose story had ignited the city. What had once been her sanctuary now stood exposed under the harsh glare of public attention. Yet for every intrusion, there came a counterbalance of community love. Neighbors arrived throughout the day, slipping past journalists with covered dishes and warm embraces. Mrs. Oliveira from 3 doors down brought homemade sweet tea in mason jars. Pastor Mendez delivered fresh bread after morning service, his deep voice offering prayers that seemed to temporarily push back the chaos. Inside, Gloria sat at her kitchen table, the curtains drawn against prying lenses. The sweet, comforting aroma of Pesigo Calda filled the small space. Walter had prepared his specialty peach preserves, the recipe passed down from his mother. The familiar scent transported Gloria back to childhood Sundays, before uniforms and badges had become symbols of fear rather than protection. "They can take many things," Walter said, placing a weathered hand over his daughter's, "but they cannot take your dignity." His eyes, still sharp despite his retirement from the Policia Federal, surveyed the room with the vigilance of someone who understood threats all too well. Gloria nodded, then closed her eyes. Her lips moved in silent prayer, barely audible even in the quiet kitchen. The weight of what lay ahead, depositions, testimony, public scrutiny, pressed down on her shoulders. Yet something was shifting inside her, a strength building from the very wounds Ricardo Costa had inflicted. Her smartphone buzzed with another message of support, this time from a former patient who'd recognized her on the evening news. The screen illuminated briefly, casting a soft glow across the table, where newspaper clippings and legal documents now mingled with family photos. "Marcos called," Walter informed her, refilling her cup. "He says the community church leaders want to organize a prayer vigil tomorrow night." Gloria took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet peach scent. Outside, camera flashes punctuated the evening like artificial lightning, but they couldn't penetrate the warmth within these walls. Each casserole delivered by a neighbor, each handwritten note slipped under her door, each call from a colleague at the hospital, these were the true flashes of light in the darkness. "Tell him yes," she finally answered, her voice finding its strength. The legal battle loomed on the horizon like an approaching storm. But Gloria was no longer facing it alone. In the crucible of injustice, she had discovered that her community would not let her fall. City Hall was packed to capacity for the press conference, the air conditioning struggling against the heat of cameras and bodies. Mayor Antonio Souza approached the podium with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and began with carefully chosen words about isolated incidents and pending investigations. Gloria Silva sat cross-legged on her kitchen floor, the television volume turned up as she sipped sweet tea. Walter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they watched the mayor dodge questions with political precision. "We take all allegations seriously," Antonio insisted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "But we must not rush to judgment based on social media outrage." The assembled journalists shifted restlessly in their seats. A reporter from the Salvador Daily stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Mayor, I have here documentation of 17 similar incidents in the past 2 years alone," she announced, holding up a folder. "All involving Officer Ricardo Costa, all complaints dismissed without investigation, all victims from the same neighborhoods." The press room erupted, cameras flashed as Antonio's face darkened, his rehearsed composure crumbling. He raised his hands, attempting to regain control, but the questions came rapid fire now, a dam of silence finally broken. Is there systemic racism in your police department? How many officers are under investigation? Will Officer Costa be suspended during the investigation? In Gloria's kitchen, Walter leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. "They're cornering him," he murmured. "Look at his face." The mayor fumbled through non-answers, promising full transparency while revealing nothing. When pressed about Gloria specifically, he referred to her as the alleged victim and suggested that all facts aren't yet known. Gloria set down her cup with such force that tea splashed onto the tile. The dismissive way he spoke about her experience, as if her humiliation were theoretical, debatable, ignited something deep within her. "That's enough," she whispered, standing up. "I'm not just a case number. I'm not just a viral video." Walter looked up at his daughter, recognizing the determination in her eyes, the same fire he'd seen in the mirror during his days with the Policia Federal. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Gloria turned away from the television, where the mayor was now hastily concluding the disastrous press conference. I need to call Marcos," she said, reaching for her phone. "It's time to speak out, not just for me, but for all 17 of those cases, for everyone who didn't have a video, for everyone who's been silenced." As she dialed, Gloria felt a strange calm settle over her. Fear remained, but something stronger had taken root. The understanding that her voice now carried the weight of many. The summer heat in Salvador intensified, bringing with it not just sweltering temperatures, but a wave of public outrage. Demonstrations filled the narrow streets, growing larger with each passing day. Church choirs from across the city positioned themselves at the front of these marches, their powerful voices carrying traditional hymns and freedom songs that echoed off the colorful colonial facades and ancient cobblestone streets. Gloria Silva watched from her father's car as Walter drove slowly past one such gathering. She pressed her palm against the window, moved by the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, all united in their demand for justice. Walter squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting both pride and concern. "They're singing for you, Filha," he said softly. The movement had taken on a life of its own. Local artists worked through the nights, transforming blank walls into vibrant murals depicting Gloria's face. These weren't portraits of victimhood, but celebrations of resilience. Her eyes painted fierce and unbowed, her expression one of quiet determination. The artists captured something Gloria herself was only beginning to recognize: her own strength. Marcos Rocha organized legal workshops in community centers, explaining to citizens their rights when interacting with police. At one such event, he pointed to a freshly painted mural visible through the window. "Gloria didn't ask to become a symbol," the attorney told the packed room, "but her courage has given others the strength to come forward with their own stories." Indeed, dozens had approached Marcos with accounts of similar treatment by Ricardo Costa and other officers. Each testimony strengthened their case and deepened community resolve. Even Mayor Antonio Souza could no longer ignore the situation. He scheduled press conferences only to cancel them at the last minute, caught between political self-preservation and mounting public pressure. Meanwhile, Helena Martins methodically built her federal investigation, interviewing witnesses in a small office borrowed from the local courthouse. The agent's reputation for thoroughness made Ricardo increasingly nervous. Those who knew him said he'd stopped appearing in public altogether. For Gloria, the transformation was both overwhelming and profound. Walking to the grocery store one afternoon, she was approached by an elderly woman who clasped her hands and whispered, "You stand for all of us now." That evening, as the nurse sat on her porch listening to distant singing from yet another march, she realized the city no longer saw her as merely a victim of injustice. Salvador had embraced her as something far more powerful, a symbol of hope, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that even the most ordinary person could spark an extraordinary movement. Walter brought her sweet tea and sat beside her in comfortable silence, both watching as the summer sun set over a city transformed. The Policia Federal's intervention sent ripples through Salvador's police department. Agent Helena Martins arrived from Brasilia with a team of investigators, her stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach making an immediate impression. Known throughout Brazil for dismantling corruption networks, Helena wasted no time establishing a temporary office at the federal building downtown. "I need every complaint filed against officers Costa and Oliveira in the last 5 years," she instructed her team, methodically pinning documents to a large corkboard. Witnesses from Gloria Silva's neighborhood were called in one by one, each interview adding another piece to the disturbing puzzle of systemic abuse. The pharmacy's security footage, which Ricardo Costa had claimed was malfunctioning on the night of Gloria's arrest, mysteriously resurfaced after Helena personally visited the establishment. Senor Moreira's hands trembled as he handed over the unaltered recordings, avoiding her penetrating gaze. "Interesting how equipment repairs itself when federal badges appear," Helena remarked dryly, sliding the evidence into a sealed envelope. Meanwhile, Ricardo paced his apartment, cigarette smoke forming a cloud around him as news reports detailed the expanding investigation. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues distancing themselves from the scandal. The officer who once strutted through the precinct now jumped at shadows, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence. Daniel Oliveira found a threatening note in his locker. "Partners protect each other. Remember that." He recognized Ricardo's handwriting immediately. That evening, Ricardo cornered him in the precinct parking lot, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You keep your mouth shut," Ricardo hissed, jabbing a finger into Daniel's chest. "One word to that federal witch, and I'll make sure everyone knows about Barra incident." Daniel pushed his partner away, the mention of their past misconduct hanging between them like poison. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice barely audible. "Gloria Silva is innocent. You know it." "I know it. Since when do you care about some nurse?" Ricardo sneered. "We've done this dozens of times." Those words echoed in Daniel's mind as he drove home, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The weight of every false arrest, every fabricated report, pressed down on his conscience. He thought about his own mother, how she'd raised him to be better than this. At home, Daniel stared at his badge, once a symbol of pride, now tarnished by complicity. On his kitchen table lay Helena Martins' business card, which she'd silently slipped to him after a tense department briefing. The choice before him was clear, and for the first time in years, his path forward felt certain. The weight of conscience had become unbearable for Daniel Oliveira. After weeks of sleepless nights, his resolve finally crumbled like the ancient cobblestones beneath his feet. The young officer arranged a clandestine meeting with Marcos Rocha at Parque da Cidade, choosing the most secluded bench near the eastern entrance, where even the moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense foliage. Marcos arrived first, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. When Daniel appeared, his police uniform exchanged for civilian clothes, the attorney could see the toll this decision had taken. The officer's eyes darted nervously, scanning for witnesses or cameras. "I can't be part of this anymore," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Ricardo has gone too far. This isn't why I joined the force." He pulled a small flash drive from his pocket, clutching it tightly before finally extending his hand. "Everything's here. Internal emails where Ricardo boasts about targeting people like Gloria, falsified reports, evidence tampering. There are at least 17 other cases just like hers." Marcos took the device carefully, understanding its value went far beyond the tiny piece of plastic. "You're doing the right thing," he assured the officer. "He'll know it was me," Daniel replied, his face etched with fear. "Ricardo has friends everywhere in the department." "We'll protect you," Marcos promised, though both men knew the risks involved. The next morning, armed with this explosive evidence, the attorney filed a comprehensive class action lawsuit representing Gloria Silva and 16 other victims of similar abuses. The courthouse steps in Salvador became an impromptu stage as Marcos addressed a growing crowd of supporters and journalists. Gloria stood beside him, her nurse's badge prominently displayed on her blouse, no longer a symbol of her profession alone, but of her identity and dignity. The woman who had once sought only to pick up her medication in peace now found herself thrust into the spotlight as the face of a movement against systemic injustice. This isn't just about me anymore," Gloria told Luciana Cardoso during an interview that would later air nationally. "This is about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been made to feel small." Walter Silva watched proudly from the sidelines, seeing in his daughter the same fierce determination that had defined his own career with the Polizia Federal. He knew better than most the courage it took to stand against corruption from within. As the crowd chanted for justice, Helena Martins observed quietly from her unmarked vehicle, making notes that would soon reach Brasilia. What had begun as one woman's humiliation was transforming into something much larger, a reckoning that would shake Salvador's institutions to their core. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial officially began. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes as the nation tuned in to what had become Salvador's most high-profile case. Gloria Silva sat beside Marcos Rocha, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. When called to testify, Gloria walked to the stand with measured steps. The nurse's badge she'd worn that fateful night was pinned to her blouse, a silent reminder of her identity beyond this case. As she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her father Walter watched from the front row, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "Ms. Silva, please tell the court what happened on the night of July 15th, Marcos prompted gently. Gloria's voice rang clear through the courtroom as she recounted every detail: the double shift at the hospital, the stop at the pharmacy, the sudden appearance of the patrol car. She described Ricardo Costa's aggressive stance and Daniel Oliveira's hesitation, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, and the humiliation of being pushed into the vehicle while neighbors watched. "And I showed them my prescription and receipt," she testified. "I've been taking the same medication for years." Ricardo's attorney, a sharp-suited man with calculating eyes, approached for cross-examination. "Isn't it true you became belligerent when the officers questioned you?" "No, sir," Gloria replied evenly. "I was confused and frightened, but I remained respectful." "And you expect us to believe 2 trained officers mistakenly arrested you without cause?" he pressed, his tone dripping with skepticism. Gloria met his gaze without flinching. "I expect the truth to speak for itself." When Marcos presented the cell phone video as evidence, the courtroom fell silent. The footage, grainy but unmistakable, showed Ricardo roughly handling Gloria while she calmly attempted to explain. The officer's voice boomed through the speakers. "People like you always think you're above the law." Gasps rippled through the audience. A juror covered her mouth in shock. Even the judge's impassive expression faltered momentarily. Ricardo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while across the room, Daniel stared at his former partner, the weight of his coming testimony visibly heavy on his shoulders. As the video ended, Gloria remained composed on the stand, her dignity intact despite reliving her humiliation. The contrast between her calm demeanor in court and the injustice captured on film wasn't lost on anyone present. "No further questions," Marcos stated, allowing the evidence to speak volumes in the stunned silence that followed. The courtroom fell silent as Federal Agent Helena Martins approached the witness stand. Her crisp uniform and unwavering gaze commanded respect as she placed a small digital recorder on the evidence table. Gloria Silva sat beside Marcos Rocha, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hope and fear battling in her chest. "Your Honor," Helena began, "during our investigation, we recovered several voice messages from Officer Costa's personal device." She pressed play, and Ricardo's voice filled the courtroom. "Got another one today," his recorded voice sneered. "These people need to learn their place. A nurse thinking she can question me. I showed her." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge's expression darkened with each new recording. Ricardo shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his own words condemned him. "I don't care if the prescription was legitimate," continued another message. "Some lessons are worth teaching." Gloria closed her eyes, the vindication bittersweet. Walter reached across the bench to squeeze his daughter's shoulder, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury. "Agent Martins," the judge asked, "how many similar incidents have you documented?" 17 cases over the past 3 years, Your Honor," Helena replied, her voice steady, all following the same pattern. When Senor Moreira took the stand next, he was a shadow of the confident pharmacy manager who had altered Gloria's records. Under Marcos's methodical questioning, the man's resolve crumbled. "Did Officer Costa ask you to falsify pharmacy records regarding Miss Silva's prescription?" Marcos asked, his gentle tone belying the sharpness of his strategy. Senor Moreira glanced at Ricardo, then at the floor. "Yes," he finally admitted, voice barely audible. "And was this the first time?" The pharmacy manager's shoulders slumped. "No, he said it would help clean up the neighborhood." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Antonio Souza, watching from the back row, loosened his tie as sweat beaded on his forehead. The political fallout would be devastating. Daniel Oliveira, seated apart from his former partner, stared straight ahead, relief and regret warring on his face. His testimony was scheduled for tomorrow, but today's revelations had already confirmed his anonymous tips. As the judge called for order, Gloria caught Helena's eye across the courtroom. The federal agent gave her the slightest nod, a gesture of respect between two women who understood the cost of standing firm against corruption. Outside, the humid Salvador air carried the sound of church bells. Inside, strand by strand, the web of lies unraveled, exposing the truth Gloria had known all along. Mayor Antonio Souza paced his office, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The scandal had grown beyond containment, with national media descending on Salvador like vultures. His political career hung by a thread. "We need to make this go away," he told his advisers, loosening his tie. "Offer her whatever she wants." The next morning, Gloria Silva sat across from the mayor's representatives in a private conference room. The settlement offer was substantial, enough money to retire comfortably, move to a new neighborhood, start fresh. All she needed to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and drop the public case. Gloria studied the document, feeling the weight of Walter's hand on her shoulder. She thought of the other victims who had reached out to her, the elderly man wrongfully detained, the teenage boy humiliated on his way home from school, the pregnant woman forced to stand in the heat during a baseless search. "No," she said simply, pushing the papers away. "This isn't about money." The mayor's representative leaned forward. "Ms. Silva, be reasonable. This is a generous offer." "Justice isn't served behind closed doors," Gloria replied, her voice steady. "What happened to me is happening to others. The system needs to change, not just compensate me." As she left the building, reporters called out questions. Gloria walked past them with her head high, Walter matching her stride for stride. Across town, Marcos Rocha reviewed case notes in his cramped office when Luciana Cardoso arrived with coffee. Their professional relationship had evolved gradually, almost imperceptibly. What began as source meetings had become dinner discussions, then late-night phone calls, analyzing developments. The mayor tried to buy her silence. Luciana said, setting down the cups, "My source confirmed it." Marcos smiled. "And I'm guessing she refused?" "Of course she did." Luciana's admiration was evident. "She's extraordinary." The attorney reached for her hand across the desk, their fingers intertwined naturally, comfortably. Neither acknowledged the gesture explicitly. Their focus remained on the case, but the connection between them provided strength they both needed. "The defense filed 3 motions today," Marcos said. "They're getting desperate." Luciana nodded, already formulating tomorrow's article. Her reporting had transformed public perception, humanizing Gloria while exposing the systemic issues at play. Together, They were creating both legal and public pressure that was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, protesters gathered daily, their numbers growing. Church groups organized prayer vigils. Artists painted murals depicting Gloria's story on buildings throughout Salvador. The mayor might have offered money, but Gloria had found something far more valuable, a voice that could no longer be silenced, and a platform for change that no settlement could purchase. The courthouse steps disappeared beneath a sea of people on the final day of the trial. Hundreds gathered in the sweltering Salvador heat, their bodies pressed together in solidarity, faces glistening with sweat and anticipation. Every 15 minutes, church bells rang out across the city, a coordinated symphony of support that made the ground beneath them vibrate. Walter Silva stood beside Gloria, his weathered hand firmly gripping hers. The retired Policia Federal agent's eyes scanned the crowd with professional assessment, but the emotion etched across his face was purely personal. Pride shone through the deep lines of worry that had settled there over the past months. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered to his daughter, his voice nearly lost in the crowd's murmur. "All these years fighting corruption, and it takes my little girl to bring the whole city together." Gloria squeezed her father's hand. The nurse, who had once sought only to heal individual patients, now found herself at the center of a movement that might heal an entire system. Sweat trickled down her back as she watched more supporters arrive, carrying handmade signs and Brazilian flags. Among the crowd, Luciana Cardoso moved with her camera crew, capturing testimonies from citizens who'd experienced similar injustices. The journalist caught Marcos Rocha's eye across the plaza, and they exchanged a brief, meaningful glance before returning to their respective roles in this unfolding drama. "Your father taught you well," an elderly woman told Gloria, pressing a small package of homemade pesigo emcalda into her hands. "To stand tall when they try to break you, that's a lesson for all of us." Walter nodded, remembering his own battles against corrupt officials during his years with the federal police. He had witnessed injustice, had fought against it from within the system, but never had he seen such a unified response from ordinary citizens. Church leaders stood alongside merchants, students linked arms with grandmothers. The divisions that typically fractured Salvador seemed temporarily mended. "This is different," Walter said, his voice stronger now. "This isn't just about one case anymore." Helena Martins approached them, her official Policia Federal badge catching the sunlight. "The evidence is overwhelming," she informed them quietly. "Ricardo's network of corruption goes deeper than we initially thought." As the courthouse doors opened and the crowd surged forward, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for systemic change. His daughter had accomplished what decades of internal investigations had failed to do. She had made injustice visible to everyone. Gloria straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, Salvador would never be the same. And neither would she. The verdict fell like thunder across the packed courtroom. Ricardo Costa was found guilty on all counts: falsifying evidence, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. The judge's voice, firm and unwavering, delivered the justice Gloria Silva had fought so hard to secure. Daniel Oliveira, standing with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes, received a lighter sentence in recognition of his eventual cooperation and the crucial evidence he had provided to Marcos Rocha. When the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the gallery erupted in cheers and sobs. Gloria sat motionless for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as Walter placed his weathered palm over hers. The retired federal agent's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he whispered, "It's over, Fila. You did it." Outside the courthouse, Salvador transformed into a celebration. Church bells rang out across the city, their peals carrying news of the verdict to neighborhoods where similar injustices had been buried and forgotten. People poured into the streets, embracing strangers and sharing their own stories of encounters with Ricardo and officers like him. "This isn't just my victory," Gloria told the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. her nurse's badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. This belongs to everyone who was ever silenced, everyone who was ever made to feel small. National media descended upon the city, their vans and equipment creating a forest of antennas and cameras. Luciana Cardoso, microphone in hand, fought back tears as she reported live, her professional demeanor briefly cracking when she caught Marcos's eye in the crowd. "What we're witnessing here in Salvador is nothing short of revolutionary," she told viewers across Brazil. "A single woman's courage has exposed corruption that has festered for years." Mayor Antonio Sousa, who had once offered Gloria a private settlement, now rushed to position himself at her side for photographs, his political instincts recognizing which way the wind was blowing. She allowed it, understanding that his support, however opportunistic, would help cement the changes she fought for. Helena Martins, the federal agent who had meticulously built the case, stood at the edge of the crowd, a rare smile softening her usually stern features. She nodded once at Gloria, a gesture of respect between warriors. As evening fell, Gloria stood on the courthouse steps, exhausted but radiant, the weight that had pressed upon her shoulders since that humid night outside the pharmacy had finally lifted. She raised her chin, standing taller than she ever had before, as camera flashes captured the image that would appear on front pages across the nation. A woman who had transformed personal injustice into collective triumph. In the weeks following the verdict, Salvador underwent a transformation that few had thought possible. The police department, once a fortress of unchecked power, implemented sweeping reforms under the watchful eyes of federal investigators. Gloria Silva, the nurse whose dignity had sparked a movement, was named honorary chair of the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, a position she accepted with characteristic humility and unwavering resolve. "This isn't about me," she told the crowded room during her first meeting. "This is about ensuring no one else has to stand where I stood." Helena Martins remained in the city longer than anticipated, personally overseeing the restructuring process. The federal agent's methodical approach left no stone unturned as she dismantled the corrupt networks that had protected officers like Ricardo Costa for years. Meanwhile, Mayor Antonio Sousa, sensing the shifting political winds, publicly embraced the reforms he had initially resisted. For Gloria, life settled into a new rhythm. Her nursing shifts remained demanding, but her colleagues now looked at her with newfound respect. Patients would sometimes whisper their thanks, not just for her medical care, but for standing up when others couldn't. Sunday mornings brought a beautiful new tradition. Neighbors would arrive at her doorstep in small groups, bearing homemade treats and stories to share. The aroma of sweet tea and pêssego em calda filled her modest home, mingling with the sounds of laughter and gospel music playing from her old radio. Her kitchen, once a private sanctuary, became a gathering place for community healing. Walter Silva watched these transformations with quiet pride. The retired federal agent had spent decades fighting corruption from within the system, but his daughter had accomplished something he never could. She had changed hearts. "You've done good, Fila," he told her one evening, his weathered hand covering hers. Marcos Rocha and Luciana Cardoso became regular visitors, their professional interest in Gloria's case having blossomed into genuine friendship. The attorney and journalist had become Salvador's most prominent power couple, using their platforms to ensure the reforms weren't just temporary measures. Daniel Oliveira, granted leniency for his cooperation, had begun speaking at police academies about ethical policing. His journey from complicity to conscience offered a path forward for others. Even as her life settled into this new normal, Gloria kept the handwritten notes from strangers who'd been inspired by her courage. She stored them in a wooden box beside her bed, reminders that sometimes justice begins with a single voice refusing to be silenced. Gloria Silva stood on her porch, watching the sun cast golden rays across Salvador's vibrant streets. 6 months had passed since the verdict, yet people still recognized her at the market, at church, in the hospital corridors where she had returned to work. Some approached with grateful handshakes, others with reverent nods, all acknowledging what her stand had meant for their community. The nurse smiled as she sipped her sweet tea, savoring the quiet moment. Her father Walter appeared beside her, newspaper in hand, his weathered face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since before the arrest. "They're implementing the new police oversight committee next week," he said, pointing to the headline. "Your case changed everything." Gloria nodded, remembering how Ricardo Costa's conviction had sent shockwaves through the department. The disgraced officer now served time while his former partner, Daniel Oliveira, worked with community outreach programs as part of his reduced sentence. Their fall had triggered investigations across multiple precincts, exposing similar abuses of power. Inside her kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with pesigo calda, prepared for the Sunday gathering that had become tradition. Neighbors would arrive soon, bringing dishes and stories. The community bonds strengthened through shared struggle. Her phone buzzed, a message from Marcos Rocha. The attorney and Luciana Cardoso had become frequent visitors, their romance blossoming alongside their continued advocacy work. The text contained a photo of Mayor Antonio Sousa signing the final reform bill, his political survival dependent on embracing the very changes he'd once resisted. Helena Martins had returned to Brasilia after completing her investigation, but not before ensuring Senor Moreira faced consequences for falsifying pharmacy records. The federal agent's thoroughness had uncovered patterns of discrimination that could no longer be ignored or denied. Gloria placed her cup down and closed her eyes, listening to the distant church bells. She thought about how her life had transformed, not just through vindication, but through purpose. The woman who once sought only to finish her shift and return home in peace now sat on advisory boards and spoke at community forums. Yet she remained herself, still finding joy in gospel music floating from her radio, still cherishing quiet evenings beneath the magnolia trees, still wearing her nurse's badge with the same compassion that had always defined her. As the first neighbors appeared at her gate, Gloria welcomed them with a warm embrace. Salvador had changed, and so had she. But her greatest victory wasn't the lawsuit or the reforms. It was knowing that her courage had cleared a path for others, showing them they need never walk with heads bowed or voices silenced. Her storm had indeed brought cleansing rain, and from it new growth had emerged.